You've heard everything about Gen Z. They're addicted to their phones, they're too sensitive, they killed everything from cereal to casual dining to the concept of working a 9 to 5 without complaining about it. But here's the problem. Most of what you've heard is surface level. It stops at the behavior and never asks why. Because when you actually dig into the psychology underneath, what you find isn't a generation of fragile, chronically online kids. What you find is a group of people shaped by a collision of forces so intense and so unprecedented that honestly, the surprising thing isn't that they're struggling, it's that any of them are functioning at all. Let's start with the thing nobody wants to say out loud. Gen Z, born roughly between 1997 and 2012, is the first generation in recorded history to grow up with the full weight of mass surveillance built directly into their social lives, and they didn't know it was happening. Picture this. You're 11 years old. It's 2010. You get your first smartphone and Instagram account. You post a photo. 20 people like it. Your brain, which is literally still developing its prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for long-term thinking and impulse control, gets a small dopamine spike. You post again. The likes vary, sometimes more, sometimes nothing. Neuroscientists call this a variable reward schedule. It's the same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines so addictive, and an entire generation got plugged into it before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. A 2019 study in JAMA Pediatrics found significant correlations between social media use and internalizing problems in adolescence. But the real damage wasn't just screen time, it was what the screen time replaced. Gen X came home to an empty house. Gen Z came home and walked straight into a digital arena where their worth was being publicly scored in real time. Every photo, every caption, every opinion became a performance, and the audience never left. This created something psychologists now call self-objectification, a phenomenon where a person begins to observe themselves from an imagined external perspective constantly. Where previous generations developed identity mostly in private, through journaling, daydreaming, unsupervised afternoon chaos, Gen Z developed identity under an audience. The psychological consequence is significant. When you're always performing yourself, you sometimes forget who you actually are when nobody's watching. But here's where it gets complicated, because Gen Z didn't just passively absorb this, they adapted to it in ways that are genuinely fascinating. They became the most media-literate generation in history, almost by accident. A kid who grows up watching advertisements, influencers, political spin cycles, and viral manipulation before age 13 develops a finely tuned sensor for inauthenticity. Research from Project Information Literacy found that Gen Z applies intense skepticism to information sources, not because they were taught to, but because they were burned enough times to learn on their own. They don't trust institutions, they don't trust authority, they definitely don't trust anyone who tries too hard. And that distrust didn't come from nowhere. This is a generation that watched the 2008 financial crisis vaporize their parents' stability before they were old enough to understand what a mortgage was. They were in middle school during Occupy Wall Street. They were in high school during a string of mass shootings that turned their schools into threat assessments. They entered adulthood during a global pandemic that shut the world down for 2 years and permanently restructured the economy they were supposed to walk into. Psychologists studying trauma exposure use a term called cumulative adversity. The idea is that it's not any single event that reshapes a person's psychology, it's the accumulation, the stacking, event after event after event, until the nervous system recalibrates around a new baseline. For Gen Z, that baseline is uncertainty, not as an occasional visitor, as a permanent resident. This is why Gen Z has higher rates of anxiety than any previously measured generation. Not because they're weak, because their nervous systems are responding rationally to an environment that genuinely has been unstable. The brain doesn't catastrophize for no reason. It catastrophizes when it has learned, through repeated experience, that catastrophe is a real possibility. And yet, something strange happened inside that anxiety, a kind of emotional fluency that older generations find almost uncomfortable to witness. Gen Z talks about mental health the way previous generations talked about the weather, openly, specifically, and without apparent shame. They have vocabulary for their internal states that most adults in therapy for a decade are still developing. Terms like emotional dysregulation, attachment styles, cognitive distortions. These aren't clinical jargon to Gen Z. They're the natural language of people who grew up crowdsourcing their psychology on the internet when the adults around them had no answers. There's a real upside here. Stigma around mental illness has measurably declined among Gen Z. They're more likely to seek help, more likely to advocate for each other, more likely to recognize when something is genuinely wrong. But researchers also note a risk, a pattern where the language of psychology becomes a substitute for resilience rather than a tool for building it, where labeling an experience becomes a way to stop moving through it. The best version of Gen Z's emotional intelligence is remarkable. The worst version is a kind of permanent victim vocabulary, and the line between them is thinner than most people want to admit. Now let's talk about their relationship with work, because it's being wildly misread. People call Gen Z lazy. What they actually are is the first generation to openly say that suffering for the sake of suffering isn't a virtue. They watched their parents grind for 40 years in exchange for loyalty that evaporated in a single round of corporate restructuring. They saw the promise of hustle culture and then watched the people who followed it end up burned out, divorced, and scrolling LinkedIn at 2 a.m. wondering what it all meant. Their unwillingness to work themselves into the ground isn't apathy. It's a logical update based on available evidence. Gen Z isn't anti-work. They're anti-pointless work. Give them a reason, give them genuine autonomy, let them see the impact of what they're doing, and they are ferociously, almost frighteningly capable. What they won't do is perform productivity for its own sake. They won't sit at a desk for 8 hours to prove presence. They won't pretend enthusiasm for systems they can see are broken. And to older generations, that refusal to play along reads as disrespect. What it actually is honesty. There's a paradox buried here too. Gen Z craves deep connection more than any generation since the boomers. Study after study shows they report higher rates of loneliness than any other demographic. Jean Twenge's research at San Diego State found that loneliness began spiking sharply among teenagers right around 2012, precisely when smartphone adoption crossed the threshold. All that connectivity, all those followers, all that ambient social noise, and somehow more alone than ever. Because the connection they're surrounded by is thin, it's fast, it's optimized for engagement rather than intimacy, and some part of their nervous system knows the difference. Gen Z didn't choose this world. They were born into the end of one era and the unsteady beginning of another. They inherited a burning house and are simultaneously expected to put out the fire and pay rent on it. Their anxiety is a rational response. Their distrust is earned. Their emotional fluency is a survival skill. Their refusal to pretend otherwise is, in its own strange way, the most honest thing about them. They're not the problem generation, they're the proof of concept generation. The living demonstration of what happens when you take human development and run it through completely novel conditions and see what survives. What survives is weird and brilliant and wounded and resilient at all once, and that's the most human thing in the world. If this made you think differently about someone you know, share it. And if you want to go deeper on this kind of psychology, the join button is right there. It genuinely helps keep this going.